Okay, this is Mr. Gillum, and today we're going to be looking at an example in your Practice and Problem Solving book on page 183. It says the number of runners on a marathon team this year is 6 more than 4 times the number of runners on last year's team. Half of the runners this year are female and half are male. What expression represents the number of female runners on the team this year? Wow, super complicated problem. Lots of words, lots of things to think about. Let's start with just the first part of the information. It says the number of runners on a marathon team this year is 6 more than 4 times the number of runners on last year's team. When I look just at that, what I see is 6 more than. More than is one of those phrases that really indicates that 6 needs to come at the end of the expression. So I know we need 6 more than 4 times the number of runners on last year's team. Now we don't really know how many runners were on last year's team, so we can use a variable to represent the number of runners on last year's team. So let's just use the variable x because that seems to always be the most common variable that we use. I'm going to say that the number of runners on this year's team compared to last year's team would be 4x plus 6, where x is the number of runners on last year's team. Okay. It then goes on to say that half the runners this year are female and half the runners are male. So this represents all, this one represents all runners this year. That's what this expression represents. Then I know that half of them could be represented as 1/2 times 4x plus 6, or I could think of it as 4x plus 6 divided by 2, like that. So this expression would actually represent either the males or the females because it's 1/2. It would actually represent the males and the females. So really what we have for 4x plus 6 is we have half males and half females. Okay, half plus a half will make a whole, 4x plus 6. So it says, what expression represents the number of female runners on the team this year? Okay, well, this question actually could ask you what expression represents the number of female runners, or it could say the number of male runners on the team this year, because in this case, because it's exactly half, then it doesn't matter whether we're talking about the males or the females, there's the same number of each. If it had said, if there was 1/3 of the team was males, then that would make 2/3 of the team females. So then we would say 1/3 would be males and 2/3 would be females, because that would also make a whole. But it doesn't say that. It just says half and half. So I know that one side represents the males, one side represents the females. So it goes on to explain using a model. If we have last year's runners and we call them R, okay, so I use the letter X, but they're using R in the example. Half of those, so they chop all these in half, would be males and half would be females. So you can see that we have half of the 4 R's plus 6. And so I wrote it kind of like this. This would kind of represent chopping it in half. But I like to think of it as half of. Half of means multiply, so half of. And you can see they also represented it that way as well. Again, if it said like 1/3 of the runners were male, then 1/3 of them would be male and 2/3 of them would be female, and so on. So I hope that helps you answer some of the questions here. Farther down on the list, we have the expression. We need to probably substitute some values in there for the number of runners. It's probably going to ask something like, oh, if there was 1 runner last year, then how many runners were there this year? And so we will take out the R and we'll put in the number that it says the number of runners that they had. And we'll use substitution. Please make sure in substitution, last thing I want you to write down, substitution, when you're taking out a letter and putting in a number, use parentheses where the letter used to be, please. I'm going to really be looking for that, okay? And I've noted it here on the video. I got recorded evidence that I said that. So make sure you're using parentheses when you're substituting. You're taking out R and you're putting in a number. Make sure you're doing that, okay? With